Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Making of a High Performance Board. This is a webinar on what it takes to be an effective condominium or community association board member. From defining a vision and maintaining open communication to understanding your fiduciary duty, we'll look to arm you with strategies to successfully lead your community into the future. My name is Travis Brandt. I'm a director with First Service Residential, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before we dive in and introduce our panelists, I did just want to share a couple housekeeping items with everybody. If you have questions throughout the webinar, we are going to address those at the end. You can submit those through the Q&A option on your control panel. We'll also have a series of poll questions during today's webinar. We'll be discussing the results of those polls, and our panelists will be chatting with what they find. We have almost 300 folks, board members, on today's webinar, so we're excited to see those real-time results. And once those results are shared, you can just click the X button and it'll just take you back to the presentation. There's also no need to take notes. If you've ever attended any of our webinars before, we'll be recording this session and sending it out afterwards to everybody that registered. So you will get a full recording of today's session with the full presentation as it's shown. And finally, a few minutes after we get started, we'll be sharing a self-assessment in the chat box. We've used this with a number of board members and surveys in the past. It's always been a very valuable tool to assess your board and your effectiveness. So we'd encourage you to take a look at it, share it with your fellow board members. It's very helpful in addressing gaps and making sure that you're working to be the most effective board you can be for your community. So with that, I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. We thank you all for joining us. First, we have George Dominguez, Regional Director with First Service. Good morning, George. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure. Thanks for joining. Jeff Musselman is a Vice President at First Service. Jeff, good morning.
Good morning, Travis.
And finally, Allison Thiel, Regional Director with First Service. Allison, great to see you. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Looking forward to today's discussion. So I just wanted to introduce what we're going to be talking about today. As North America's property management leader, we know that condo and community associations are only effective as the leaders and the board members who run them. But as a board member, you likely ask yourself, how do you know if your board is working to the best of their ability? And are there areas of improvement? Are there areas that you can do even better? So today we're going to dive through a number of topics, but we'll be focusing on 7 key areas that impact board effectiveness. Those would be the community vision, the communication with your membership, the finances of the community, governance, leadership of the board, how you run meetings, and reserves. And as I mentioned previously, we will have a chance to dive into some of the questions that are asked at the end of the presentation based on the feedback that we get from you all. So please don't hesitate to share those questions in the Q&A box that you can see there at the control panel at the bottom. So as we dive into our first topic about your community vision, we do want to start with a poll question that you should see pop up right now. Has your community established a vision or mission statement for the association? Yes, no, or unsure. You can click that box or that answer rather, and we'll have our results here in just a few seconds. To see how many communities out there have an established vision or mission statement. And we should have our results here in just a second. Okay, so 24% of our attendees, their community does have a mission statement or a vision. 47%, do not. 29% are unsure, which is interesting. I think a lot of times when we talk about a vision or a mission statement, it sounds like this big idea. It sounds like this, grandiose type of statement, big words, weird grammar. But George, tell us a little bit about the importance of a community vision or a mission statement.
Thank you so much, Travis. I totally agree. I think that one of the most important things as a board, as a group of leaders that are elected to serve in a community, I think it's so important to have a focus. and set priorities for the rest of the time that you are serving on the board. It helps you kind of keep track of what is really important. And then also strategically plan, not only for what your time during the board is gonna look like, but also from beyond, maybe a 2, 3, 4, even 5-year plan outboard.
The other thing too, Travis, that I've noticed with the communities that have the vision statement is that a number of the documents and rules and regulations around condos and homeowners associations, are well written. They're black and white, and this is how we do things. The vision statement tends to be the feeling side of the community, the spirit of the community, what they want it to feel like, what their objectives are. Think of like the softer side, and that's a very important component, because you're talking about an environment with a large number of people living together. If you're in a high-rise environment, it's a very tight environment. If it's an HOA, you're spread out, but you still have a sense of community. So the communities that I've seen that have utilized that vision statement for that have really benefited from that softer side.
Yes, and I agree with that. I just wanted to comment quickly in that a lot of times, like you said, Travis, the word vision or mission statement can be a little intimidating. And if a community and a board just really focuses on what they want their priorities to be for that community, and then when you focus on those priorities, the mission or the vision really will be birthed out of what your priorities are and how you want your friends and neighbors to perceive your community, right? Because this is your home.
Yeah.
I think a good vision statement also instills a lot of confidence, which is, in front of your members, that's really important. The board, your membership really has to put a lot of trust in what you do. And so setting a good vision and a good mission statement, I think definitely sets the right path into saying, here's what we're going to be focusing on, here's how we're going to govern. And I think that that's definitely going to instill a lot more confidence with your community and your community members.
Absolutely. And I think the point you all made is important. This is a personal thing, right? These are people's homes. This is where they live. Jeff, I think it's, the softer side of things says it perfectly, but I've also heard it described, how would you describe your community to a potential buyer? What kind of community, what feel does the community have? And so I think it is important to have that guiding light from a high level, right? From a 10,000-foot view. So appreciate that. As we move forward, I did want to dive in a little bit on communication. I think we all know the importance of it. I think we all know what can happen in the absence of it. And so, again, I want to get the feel from our attendees today with another poll question. So, what channels do you use in your community to communicate with residents? And so, this is a multiple choice. You can choose all that apply. And the options would be email blasts, newsletters to the community on various weekly or monthly bases, community websites, flyers, maybe within the community on a bulletin board, internal communication systems. I think those are beginning to get a little bit more popular, or other methods as well, something additional or something a little bit creative. So we'll give everybody just a few more seconds to go ahead and respond there before we see our results. Let's see how this plays out. Beautiful. So I think we always like to see a mix of communication, right? I think that everybody communicates differently. It's important to really reach your audience in a number of different ways. 92% of our attendees do use email, 56% use newsletters, 72% do use their community website, 46% use flyers, 28% internal communications, and 12 use other methods. So something, like I said, a little bit more creative. Allison, I know communication is something you're very passionate about. Can you share a little bit about, how high-performing boards that you work with approach communication?
Oh, definitely. One of the most important cornerstones for a happy community is an informed community, right? So when you hear every single year you have an election and a board can transition, it's important that the communication from one year to the next year stay consistent. And what we as leaders in the industry do to help our boards with that consistency and with that open and transparent communication is to encourage setting a regular set schedule, have meetings, get your residents involved, open the channel of communication, right? Because the board and the residents, you are all part of the same community. So it's important to, to keep that open communication. And I have an analogy I love to use that the panelists here have heard before. The relationship between a board and management and the residents, and a lot of times is like an arranged marriage. And the happiest and healthiest marriages and relationships that everybody knows is when you have really good, open and healthy communication. You don't always have to agree, but you have to agree to disagree and then move forward for what's best for your community.
I love that, Allison. When you were touching about transparency, I think transparency is key. And sometimes when we share that word with our board members, we say to them, regardless of what's going on, I think whether it's positive, I think it's good to highlight successes, or if there are things happening with the community that the community should be aware about, we should always be able to share it. That way there are no surprises. If there's something that perhaps can turn into a much more of a sensitive nature, right? And so, but we always say, just put it out there and just talk about it. I think some of the more successful meetings that we have had where that maybe a special assessment was being discussed, maybe an incident occurred, is when we all have something to say and everybody's able to go ahead and hear from the board about what's happening and be very forthcoming.
George, I agree on that statement about like the special assessment and the communication. And one of the things I've seen at some of the communities that really take this subject seriously is they try to get out ahead of the issue. For example, if there's a special assessment on the horizon for the community or a significant change to the budget, for example, South Florida right now, or Florida as a whole, is going through some pretty significant changes in insurance costs. So getting that message out to the community before the impact is realized, i.e. the increase in the budget, and having discussion around it. So on the day that it occurs and the budget comes out, people will know and it gives them a chance to vent. So I think there's two parts. One, obviously addressing what's going on, but also, the property manager and the board working together to look at what's on the horizon. What should we start planting some seeds, getting people ready for coming up. And that helps us navigate through things like special assessments and budget increases and things like that.
One thing to consider is even perhaps if you are going to have a town hall where maybe something will be of a sensitive nature, whether a special assessment or discussing an incident, is meeting beforehand and talk about how you're going to go ahead and what your role will be in that specific town hall. That way you're all prepared to go ahead and be able to take in all the questions that someone may have, or make sure you articulate your points properly. But don't forget also, it's also good to communicate your highlights. So your successes, things that you have done, that you've completed over a quarter or over a half a year or over a year. I think residents need to know that as well, because a lot of times there's so much that they don't see. And we have this powerful tool called email that everybody is connected to, and we can go ahead and articulate all of the good things as well with the community.
Yeah, and we saw on the poll that email was the top winner for the use in communication. And since COVID, we've all become very technology based. So I think all of our lives have been ramped up with the use of email and setting a consistent schedule, because I have seen in a lot of communities when they know that the newsletter comes out on the first Tuesday or the last Friday of every month, and the meeting is monthly and it's always on a particular day and a particular time, it helps with consistency and understanding and getting the message out, because if you skip a month and then you skip a second month, it can create confusion and misunderstanding, and then you lose that transparency. So setting a set schedule, I think, is imperative.
One of the things that we actually recommend to our clients is that they allow us to send a weekly news, like quick little tidbit, like the manager's quick little, this is the week in recap. And I think those are excellent because again, that provides a lot more information about the community, If schedule, for example, the changes to schedule to landscaping has occurred, well, that goes in the weekly update from manager. It doesn't have to be a paragraph. It doesn't have to be a book. It can be very concise. I call it like my little USA Today tidbits. Just enough information so everybody knows what's going on.
George, I think that frequency issue, and Allison, you talked about the consistency. The norm has typically been monthly, but if you think about it, those newsletters sometimes are massive. And the majority of us today use our phones to handle things, outside of the work environment. So I like the idea of the frequent communication, and as you said, the USA Today format. It is great because it's a quick read. I can, if landscape's important to me, I can capture that, close it out, and move on. So I think the frequency is really something for every community to look at and see in today's environment with more people connected as a result of COVID. Should you change how frequently and what method you're using for communication? And there's a lot of platforms out there as well to use that are very convenient, very colorful, very attractive to look at.
Absolutely. And I think those are great points. I know where I live, for example, we get an email every Friday afternoon with bullet points. Some weeks it's longer than others, but it instills confidence. And I know we've all talked about human nature. A lack of communication will ultimately just lead to concern, to negative assumptions. There's really no positives that come from it. So that cadence of communication is important. It's going to instill confidence. It's going to establish that transparency. So I think those are just some excellent tips there. Thank you, guys.
Travis, I think we should sum this section up with Allison's remark about the marriage, because it's absolutely true. It's that the communication is the foundation of any good relationship, business, entity, or community. So Allison, I really like that quote. That's great.
Absolutely. That's our takeaway on this one. Very good. So as we move forward, we'll dive into finances. We'll talk about this idea of fiduciary responsibility of the board. Obviously, when you join a board, you're tasked with managing dollars of your friends and your neighbors. So there's a lot of responsibility there. So we've seen many costs go up, as you guys have kind of alluded to a little bit already. So our next poll question: how often does your community look for cost savings opportunities? Are you reviewing these things quarterly? Are you doing this on an annual basis? Is it a little more loose every few years? Not too often, or maybe you're unsure. So if you go ahead and select how often your community looks for cost savings opportunities, whether on your service contracts, in your budget, on typical items of spend, how often are you looking for those benchmarking opportunities? We should have our results here in just a second. Okay. Wow. So this is excellent. So 35% of our attendees are reviewing your budgets and your service contracts for cost saving opportunities quarterly. I think that's fantastic. Another 37% are doing it annually, which is great. I think that's excellent. Always something that we recommend as part of the budget process. So over 70% are doing this on a regular basis. I think that's great. So from there, Jeff, talk to us a little bit about cost savings opportunities. What are we looking for? Obviously, COVID has really changed the game. You already mentioned the insurance that's gone up, 20, 30, in some cases, 40% for certain communities. What are the initiatives that you're recommending to some of your communities?
So first off, I recommend that you divide it up into a couple of different buckets, because a majority of your budget centers around, outside of insurance and staffing, of course, centers around maintenance and caring for the asset, whether it's grounds and landscaping or a 40-foot tower on the ocean. So you have to look, I use the categories efficiencies, cost savings, and kind of divide the two up, because you can't really just go and cut a budget 10% because that's the desire of it, perhaps a new board or pressure from the community. You really have to look at each of those areas individually and see what you can do. I think the savings come in areas of efficiencies, where you look at service contracts that you've had in the past and you partner with that vendor and tell them what your circumstances are and ask them to look at that contract again And perhaps service frequency, service levels could be modified. Perhaps there's some new pricing, and the vendors will partner with you on finding a solution. I always find it's better to partner with them rather than command to them that they do a certain thing, because you want to take good care of those vendors that are taking care of your building. And the other thing to recognize too is that in the world of finance, it is the desire of many boards to keep those maintenance fees flat. But the reality is, with the expenses you face in maintenance, insurance, and other things like that, and reserves, it's really difficult to maintain that. But as long as you go back, as we said in our prior slide, and communicate in advance what you're doing, I think it helps out quite a bit.
Yeah, and Jeff, I'm going to reiterate what you just closed with there about how important communication is. Quite often, homeowners don't understand the numbers. They see a large number on a line item on a budget, or a large, net cost at the bottom of the budget, and it's intimidating. These are not household numbers, that they run their own household with. And so that constant communication and education, right? To bring that to the residents so that they understand how that number was arrived to, right? And you need to start at the core of that, and just pick any of the priorities or the elements of your community, and then build from that point. Landscaping, everyone wants landscaping to be beautiful. What is the contract that you have for landscaping? How does it need to improve? And you sort of put those building blocks together, and the dollar value for each of those building blocks, and it will bring them to an understanding of the final number in that line item. That's one of the things I see annually in budget adoption meetings, that brings in that contention of, we don't want to pay more and we think the numbers are too high. It's the lack of understanding of why the numbers are what they are.
I think that that's really true, Allison. And, also when we talk about cost savings, we talk about also making sure that we're doing our due diligence. We're dealing with somebody else's money, right? Because the entire community puts into this fund, and the board and the manager get together and decide, like, these are the expenses, or these are the things that need to be repaired. When necessary, you always want to get a minimum of 3 bids when you're able. Obviously, if you have an emergency, I think that you may not be able to do that, but minimum 3 bids if you have like a capital expenditure or capital project, should be due diligence. The other thing, though, too, that I think is really important for our board members to know is, it's not always about who gives you the cheapest price, the least amount of cost for the service. I like to say that the right vendor will be chosen over fair cost and over a fair job. And, and I think that's really important. So often I think we see our clients, and rightfully so, I think they try to go more for the more fiscal conservative approach to these bids, or getting 3 bids whenever we're doing repairs. But you got to build some kind of a relationship with your vendors, because when we go out every single time trying to get 3 bids, what ends up happening is you end up choosing pretty much the same vendors all the time, because you'll find that this is where they are in their pricing. But then the other vendors might get, I'm not going to no longer bid this property because I never get the job. And and how else also building a strong vendor relationship is so important, because when something happens, if you have that vendor relationship, they're going to come out to you. They will drop whatever they're doing to come and see you.
It's a great point. It is such a partnership, and I think that leads to that value, right? It's not always just the lowest dollar amount, it is the value. I think one other point, you guys touched on it, when you're sharing these things with the community, when you're talking about the finances, really tell the story. Oftentimes, if there's a special assessment like one of you mentioned or something, it's not caused from something that happened yesterday. Oftentimes, these are things that have really developed over the last 5, 10, possibly 15 years, where maybe there has been that priority of just keeping things, keeping costs down and keeping assessments low. So we always encourage board members as well, really share in simple terms with the membership why things are happening, what led to those decisions, so they really do know that you're good stewards of their capital and their dollars. So really great points all around. Our next topic here, always one of the most exciting topics, but certainly something that is extremely important for board members, the topic of association governing documents. So we know the first thing a board member does when they get on the board, they print out those governing documents. They read it front to back, every word. They're always exciting. So we did want to do a quick poll for our board members on the call. How well would you say you understand your association's governing documents? Very well, a good amount, not too well, or not at all. And I know, very few of us are attorneys, but how well do you understand your association's governing documents? And we will go ahead and look at our results here. All right, so this is good. This is a good answer. So we have 33% of our attendees that say they understand their governing documents very well. Another 63% that say a good amount. So an overwhelming majority that feel they have a good understanding of the governing documents, and it's important. Allison, I know you work with a lot of communities in understanding their governing documents. What advice do you give? Where do they start? What are your tips and tricks for maybe a new board member or an existing board member to really understand those documents?
Yeah, so after reading the documents, which, sometimes can be an arduous task, and I always tell everybody it's the perfect thing to start off your evening with if you feel like you might have some insomnia, because they'll put you right to sleep. They're not the most fun read, but they are imperative. And I will tell you that for all of the managers that I have, all of us have a paper copy, with little folds and little highlights on the side, because there are those common areas in your documents that you need to refer to all the time. So this needs to be on your bedside and one of your favorite reads. It really does. And I always, the most important thing for board members to understand is the structure of the rule book that we follow. And that is your #1 rule book for your association, followed by Florida statute. And if you ever get into a situation where you're not quite sure, or your documents don't really speak clearly, and you're caught in an in-between moment, a little bit of a quagmire, you have a subject matter expert who's the expert on all of this, is your association attorney, right? So I always tell board members, the most important thing to do is to rely on the subject matter experts. You have management, you have your association attorney, and you have your CPA. So depending on what the conversation is and the element of the discussion, there is always someone that you can go to lean on.
I love that, Allison. I think it's so true what you just said. I always say that the governing documents are our Bible. We can't do too much outside of that, but we got to stick to what is in there, right? And so it's really important that either before you decide to run for the board, or if you just got newly elected to the board and you haven't had a chance to read your docs, please take a couple hours, and we'll take a couple hours to probably get through all of them. But you have to really know exactly what it is that you're managing. At the end of the day, this is a corporation, it's an asset, it's a multi-million-dollar asset. And you have to be able to know how it needs to function and what you can and cannot do. I also, whenever we have new board members elected right after election, we like to conduct a board member orientation. And in that orientation, we go through different things, like, for example, what the responsibilities of the board is, what the management responsibility, what the regional director responsibility is. And then we also go into topics like insurance and other really helpful information. And I know we're going to talk about reserves in a little bit, but it is so important to get the new board member acclimated. And so everybody understands what the expectations are all the way around.
The governance portion of the role for the board member, as both George and Allison have said, this almost provides protection to the board, because it tells you the answers to a lot of your questions that a board member is going to face from their community are going to be answered by these documents. And there is going to be pressure from the community for certain changes or certain preferences on how things are done. And sometimes those voices can be very loud and very convincing, but the board member has to maintain a clear mind, and they have to rely on these documents for that guidance. And the other point that Allison had made about, seeking, professional guidance on this, most of the documents, albeit, are a tough read, not the most exciting read you've ever had. Most of them are pretty clear, but sometimes they're clear as mud. And when you run into that situation, that's where your legal counsel comes in. And you want to think that through, because if the board makes a decision on a matter that is clear as mud, if you will, your attorney is going to be the one that's going to be defending you in that circumstance. So it only makes logical sense that you would consult them on what direction you don't ask them what to do, that's not their role, but you tell them what your direction is and why, and then they will be that neutral mind that will challenge it and will look at it from a defense standpoint. And it really, in the long run, that money spent up front will save you a considerable amount down the road, and a lot of angst within your community as well. So again, not the most exciting role of a board member, association governance, but there's a lot of protection there for you, and it's an important part.
I agree with that, Jeff.
Sorry, George, I just want to add really quick, in order to help board members really understand how to make the decisions, right? They need to have something to focus on. I boiled it down into three things. Their job is to protect, maintain, and enhance their community and their home, right? And the governing documents guide them in those three roles: protecting, maintaining, and enhancing. And really what they're protecting is the interest of the association, maintaining the common interest of everyone in the association, and enhancing the interest of everyone in the association. I mean, the ultimate goal is to enhance property values. I know all of us are always looking to do that, but you want your decisions to at least have that common goal, and then you lean into your experts.
I think that what's really interesting is that sometimes one of the toughest things that a board has to do is enforce the rules and regulations of the community. And, I totally realize that, these are your neighbors. But at the end of the day, the rules are in place so that everybody gets to enjoy their home, right? And sometimes it's a village, is what we sometimes call it, or a vertical village in cases of condos. But it's really important, to ensure that you're enforcing all your rules and regulations, and consistently. To me, I think that how you go about enforcing has a big key to do with it. I normally like to take the approach from being a good neighbor approach. So our violation letters, for example, will have it be somewhere, living part of a shared community. There are so many rules so that everybody can enjoy their home, and we would love for you to do your part. And this is what we need from you. So I don't think it needs to be where it is so, defensive, or from a defensive stance. I think it's all how you communicate it. I think it's how you present the message. And I think most people really, really appreciate the fact that if they're in violation, or maybe they're not doing something that they're supposed to be doing, the message is given in a professional and in a caring manner, and neighborly manner. I think that's key.
Yes.
I think that's a great point, George, because a lot of times it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? But at the end of the day, to your point, the majority of the people in the community want to live in an enjoyable place. They want to make it enjoyable for everybody else. And so, yeah, just really great points, Jeff. I also think what you mentioned about leaning on, your experts, your trusted advisors. We've talked before about the business judgment rule, and when you do lean on those professionals, you're really insulating yourself as a board. You're attempting to do the right thing, but the state recognizes that you're volunteers, and so by leaning on those professionals, it just really protects your interests, personally. So. Just a couple really great points there as far as how to maybe interpret those clear as mud sections of your documents. I like that. We'll move on now. We said at the beginning, obviously board members, they are the leaders of the community. We've already talked a lot about communication, but we often talk in terms of the boards and how they're communicating from a unified leadership voice. And so a quick poll for all of our attendees here. Do you believe your board speaks with a unified leadership voice? Yes, most of the time, sometimes not at all, or unsure. You can select your answers now. Allison, you mentioned earlier, it doesn't mean that you always have to agree. I think that's not the point of a board, right? healthy discussion is good for the community. Different perspectives are really how boards were designed.
Yeah.
But it's important in how you communicate. So let's take a look at our results here. So 29%, yes, they always communicate with a unified leadership voice. That's excellent. Another 36%, most of the time, that's good. That's always a good thing. Sometimes not at all, unsure. I think it's important, that when you communicate to your community, you're doing so as a unit. George, we've talked a lot about this. Talk to us about that, how you're communicating from a board to your membership. Why is it important, to be unified in those decisions?
Yes, what I think it's wonderful that when you do have elections, you have new blood is what we call it into a board. And part of what makes this really successful is the fact that it comes from different backgrounds, different experiences. And so when you come together, I am all for having open dialogue about policies that are being set in place or an incident that occurred, or I think it's just great when everybody just gets to have a say. And it may not be your own opinion, but I always love to hear a different opinion than mine, because I think it may bring to light a different solution, a better direction. But then also it's really important that once you do make that vote or you do make a decision and something has to be set in place, if you did not get unanimous approval, that you do it by majority. But it's always so important to have a unified front in front of your community. If a community sees discord among board members, I think, again, that trust starts to crack. And then they start wondering if the board is just doing the right thing or is the right decision. And, it is just so important to have that unified voice. And, board members are neighbors too, right? You're going to go to the grocery store or you're going to go somewhere and you're going to run into a neighbor and they're going to say, I didn't agree with this policy that the board set in place. And I said, well, thank you very much for that feedback. We as the board, we decided that this is the best direction for the community. And, I invite you to come to one of our meetings and talk about, if you have any concerns. So again, having that shared unified voice is so important, and it creates trust, confidence, and it's just a better and more effective way to be a leader.
If you think about, George, what you said about that unified voice, think of it like on a personal level. As a child, when you look to your parents, when they were getting along well, you felt safe as a child. You grew up and you became an adult, and now you're at work. And when your leadership team gets along, it's a nice place to work. I personally feel the community is the same way. If the board of directors is unified together, recognizing, as you said, George, the multiple opinions on any one subject and doing what's best for the masses and communicating it with properly, it's really the right thing to do. But people need to see the board as one, not because they're in collusion or they have one opinion, but that they're working together and that they're a unified force representing their community. Because the opposite of that is a disconnected board, and I did see some of that on the poll, and it's probably safe to say in those circumstances, when you have a disconnected board, you also have a disconnected community or a much greater challenge within the community. So that leadership role, again, I think it applies just like business, because this is a business. The leaders have to be seen as professionals who communicate well and communicate with one voice. I really can't stress the importance of that, because we've all, as residents and professionals, attended meetings where there was a disconnect, and the bottom line, you could say those meetings just typically aren't productive.
And, Jeff, in leadership, and we talk a lot about the board members and their leadership to the community, this is an area where I think we as a property management company is one of our most important roles. It is our job and our duty to make sure that we're supporting the board, bringing the board the information that they need, bringing them the subject matter experts, and actually helping them in being successful leaders, right? We see all the things that happen in every community and other communities that repeat themselves, and we've had the experiences, and we can bring all that knowledge and guidance to them at the table and really help them and support them in their role. And so that when they go to that monthly meeting and they're trying to have that open and transparent communication with the community, they have the backup of us and all the other subject matter experts and all the resources and information, so that they look like the leadership that they need to be perceived as, right? Because in order for the membership to feel confident in who they elected and who's running their community, they need to present well. And that really is our job, to bring that support to them and to help them in their leader-ship.
I think some of my more successful boards also have board member policies set in place. So when someone gets elected, there's like a policy on confidentiality. I think that's really, really important to have. We have an ethical policy, and then also a conflict of interest policy. And you can get with your association attorney to create these policies and make sure that everybody understands that this is really important and it's something that they have to adhere to while you're on the board. Again, it's exuding trust, confidence to the community, making sure that everybody understands that these are the expectations and this is how you're going to be leading by example, and making sure that there's no breach of either of these three very important policies.
No, and I think that's a great point. I know we've seen some of those policies, George, just on how they conduct themselves, how they operate really as that unit. And to Jeff's point, I think it just leads to a much more professional, image to the rest of the community. You said something else that I thought was interesting that I didn't want to skip over. That there's always going to be difference of opinions, and you mentioned, to encourage homeowners that maybe don't like a decision to get involved. Potentially join a committee, potentially run for the board the next year. It is important that boards are making decisions based on, the wishes of those homeowners. And so I didn't want to skip over that. I think that's excellent to always encourage those folks that maybe don't agree with a decision to get involved, to volunteer, and to maybe give some of that time, just like their board of directors is doing, right? We all know that the paycheck is fantastic, but you want to make sure that that you're getting the real feeling of the community when you are making these decisions. So that's important. Kind of on a related topic as we move forward, we're talking about leadership and how we communicate and how we make decisions. Oftentimes these decisions are being made in our meetings, in our monthly board meetings, in our annual meetings, budget meetings. It's no secret. We're all well aware the last 18 months have really just turned upside down the way that we conduct business in our communities. There's been some really creative solutions. I think it's forced a lot of associations to move to technology when maybe they otherwise wouldn't have. But our next poll question today, on July 15th, how does your community currently conduct your board meetings? Are you back to in person? Are you doing it virtually? Have you adopted more of a hybrid approach? Or are you unsure, which might be a little concerning if you're a board member, but give us your feelings. How are you currently conducting your board meetings here? We will give it just one more second. We will look at our results here. Interesting. So 12% are back to doing in person. 35% are doing virtually, and over half of you are doing a hybrid, a mix of both. I'm not surprised by that. We actually did a survey recently where we found out 89% of board members reported that they plan to continue some form of virtual involvement in their meetings. 44% reported that the convenience and flexibility of virtual platforms actually resulted in increased participation. And I think we would all agree that that's a good thing. More participation, more transparency, more communication, less frustration, right? That's the general feeling. Jeff, how did those results and the survey that we did, how does that line up to what you're seeing in your communities?
Well, Travis, first, I want to say I'm thrilled that not sure was 0%. That would have been concerning. It's basically just like the polls. One of the good things to come out of the environment we were in over the last year and a half with COVID was Zoom meetings, Teams meetings, and things like that with residents. And what I saw is I noticed a dramatic increase in participation of the residents as a result, being more informed in what was going on. So, as we project forward, hopefully some blend of that will occur, because there's a number of people who have homes that we manage or communities that we manage that it's a second or a third home for them. And this is a very convenient way for them to stay in touch with the leadership of their investment. The other thing too is as you go through these meetings, virtually or otherwise, preparation. And one thing I noticed is that it appeared that the Zoom meetings tended to influence the preparation for the meeting a little more than just sitting down in a room with people. And that was a very interesting trend to observe. Board members were having more conversations with their management team, with their property manager, with us, going into those, and then utilizing visuals and things like that are very, very helpful to kick these off. So yeah, we're seeing the same trend, and I think it's a favorable one based on certainly everything we've talked about so far of communication, openness, dialogue, etc.
I think that's so key, Jeff, as well. And, one thing to keep in mind is a lot of times, going into these board meetings, it is so important, if you're able, make sure you read your board packets ahead of time of that meeting. That way, you are prepared, you're ready to discuss any topics that need action or discuss any matters that are, noted on the agenda. Also, I would recommend sending out the public session or the open session of the agenda out ahead of time as well to the community. So if they want to attend, they know exactly what the board is planning to discuss. That way, again, going back to communication and having no surprises, transparency, I think that's also real key. And, also when necessary, if you are going to have this meeting and let's say you're talking about a capital, project coming up, or a or a repair that's going to affect a lot of people, then invite the right people to come in and possibly speak and may answer questions, not only the board's questions, but maybe your community's questions as well.
Yeah, and Jeff, you were talking about how we've seen with the Zoom meetings, with board meetings, that there's a higher participation. And I think in addition to the higher participation, there seems to be a sense that people feel like they have a voice, the residents, that they're being heard, right? It's a better sort of opportunity to everybody gather and share their thoughts. And I also see a sort of move forward in the parliamentary procedure of a meeting. In a Zoom situation, where in a room, sometimes people can talk over each other and there's conversations in the back of the room and not everyone's able to hear or pay attention. And when you're on a Zoom, that kind of situation really, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work in this platform. So it's really helped boards and management guide and lead the community to have really effective communication during the board meetings, so that you can get the communication across and that people can ask the questions. So I really think that it has helped a lot of us. I know a lot of my boards have decided to stay with the Zoom or the Zoom hybrids. Again, to go back to Jeff, to what you said, that it gives more people the opportunity, especially here in South Florida, where we have so many people that live in other places and aren't here all the time. It really has been very successful.
Allison, that was a good point about the parliamentary procedures, because I think that's another important piece, especially for a new board, is that, as you mentioned, the in-person meetings sometimes can take on their own life outside of the agenda. And again, having attended hundreds of these, as all of your panelists here have, we will all tell you that, when parliamentary procedure is announced at the beginning, this is how we're going to conduct the meeting, reassuring everyone in the audience that they will have a chance to speak, but that we do want to follow our agenda. Because again, this is a business event. You don't want this to be a bad Thanksgiving dinner event where everybody's talking all over and tables are flipped and crazy things. So you have to stay with that agenda. And then at times you have to make corrections to the audience. And that's just a reality because there's a lot of passion in the room. But it's very important that whoever is leading the board meeting, typically the president, is maintaining order in order to do that. The other thing too to think about is the visuals. Allison, you mentioned earlier, sometimes people look at things, they equate it to what's appropriate in their home, but now we're talking about, a large commercial facility, perhaps a high rise, or, a pool that's 10 times bigger than theirs. So when you put up visuals and you're talking about a mixing valve or springs under a cooling tower, people might not understand what that means and, why something like that, cost $18,000 to be replaced. So, using the visuals to help tell the story is very important during your meetings. Zoom makes that so easy to do. And then the other thing too is there's a lot of great things going on in our communities. People are getting together, they're celebrating, they're interacting with staff. Don't hesitate to put photos on a continuous loop that runs. So when people walk into the meeting or log on to the meeting, they get a flavor of the good things that are going on. Obviously, there's business to conduct as outlined by the agenda, but it's also an opportunity to, once again, talk about the feeling of the community. And you can do that through pictures.
I love what you said, that Jeff. I think it's so important because, a lot of times when people say, oh, we're going into a meeting, it can be very like, this is going to be somewhat heavy. But I think if you're actually keeping it very light and also create a sense of community, I know that, pre-COVID, sometimes we used to have like little mini 5-10 minute socials before a meeting sometimes. And, that just created an opportunity for people to, number one, talk to each other, even though, you may have been living in your home for, 5 years, you maybe don't know your neighbor 2 houses down or 3 doors down. And so when people come to a meeting and they have an opportunity to just go ahead and relate to each other and talk to each other. And then I love the idea of actually putting up, pictures of neighbors, being neighbors and being neighborly, or of social events perhaps. And I think, again, that creates a big sense of community as well.
Yeah, I even have communities that have added music. So either to the opening or the closing. So you think about like Olympic ceremonies or that kind of thing, but it is a way, because this is a moment for everyone to come together. And with COVID, we haven't had that chance, that opportunity, right? So you want to sort of personalize the technology that's going on here as much as possible so that everyone feels ultimately embraced, right? Because again, like I said, this is their home and they want to feel at home and they want to feel relaxed. And they want to enjoy it and they want to be happy. So what better than to take away the sort of black and white, very dryness of a meeting and make it personal, make it fun. So, do that little social mixer before and play a fun song. If you have a DJ that lives in the building, at the end to close, and everyone can say their salutations. It really does bring a very humanity type element to something that sometimes a board meeting can be a little dry, right?
Right. And I think, what's really great is that after a board meeting is actually held, that like sometimes after an open session, maybe for about 5 or 10 minutes, people just stick around and you could do a virtual happy hour, is what we call it. And it's actually so great to see people just relax. You just been through your meeting and hopefully you got through all your action items. And after you ended, maybe spend an extra 5, 10, 15 minutes if you're doing your Zoom calls and, just like, how's everybody doing? How you doing? Oh, by the way, I saw you the other day, and it just create this, again, sense of community. We got to get a little creative. I know, I think for most of my clients are still meeting in Zoom. Some have started meeting in person over the last 30 days. And I think everybody has just been kind of waiting to see how, going back to meeting in person, because it feels foreign to us. Because I think we do Zoom to see our families or we've been conducting business this way for the last year and a half. And so many clients and so many communities are just ready to try to get back. And of course, as long as it's in a safe environment and you feel safe and you create that opportunity for everybody to still feel, spread out, or if you need to wear a mask to feel comfortable, I think it's all going to be key to just, making it through a little further.
I think those are all great tips. It really has, George. It's kind of become second nature, but I think everybody is looking for that. So I think all three of you, really great creative tips to drive that resident engagement, to kind of start reestablishing that sense of community. I agree. I think that's something that everybody's looking for right now. So just a really great way to kind of make your meetings yours and, kind of build back that engagement that everybody was missing at the same time. So excellent tips there. Moving on, we want to dive in a little bit with reserves. Obviously, serious topic, incredibly important for a community to be, funded and to have their reserves based on their community. Last poll question here. Does your community fund their reserves? The options are yes, we have fully funded reserves. Yes, we fund them, but only partially. No, we do not fund our reserves. Or maybe you're unsure. Maybe you don't know how you're funding your reserves. So we'll give it just a second here. We will let everybody go ahead and share their reserve strategy with us, and then we'll be able to discuss. Give it one more second. Look at the results here. Let's see. Fantastic. So 98% are funding their reserves to some level. So that's excellent. 48% have fully funded reserves. That's just fantastic. 50% have partial reserves, but I think that would maybe imply that there's that knowledge of where you stand. Hopefully you're working up to that fully funded point. Allison, let's kick it off. Just talk to us a little bit about the funding of reserves, how that's specific to your community. How are you, providing guidance to your communities when it comes to the reserves?
Yeah, so the most important thing to look at is this is your piggy bank for the future, right? And what has happened in your community in the past 5, 10, 15, 20, or 40 years in regards to reserves is going to impact you in your budget decisions this year immensely. So and how I've said before that it's really important to lead into your subject matter experts. One of the subject matter experts that's so important in regards to reserves is a reserve study. That is going to define for you those items in which you need to piggy bank for. Because when you lack having the piggy bank, your reserves, ultimately there's that 3-letter word that, or the acronym for the word, what we call a SPA, which is a special assessment. It's kind of a very nice word for a special assessment, SPA, because that makes you dream. But where you lack in reserves is where you're inevitably going to have to, at some point in the lifespan of your community, going to have to pass a special assessment. So as much as it's hard to sometimes incorporate that into a budget and bring understanding about all of this money that's being poured into the bank accounts that's not really going anywhere, it is essential to what is going to happen with your community as far as everyday repair and maintenance and looking to the future. I do have some communities right now who are partially funding or whole funding, and then you have one-off situations that happen and you still need to special assess. So I think it's super important in all conversations about reserves is that there's some understanding and that you at least touch on the words of special assessment so that memberships understand that where one lacks, the other one is going to have to come in and fill that gap.
And with regard to those behaviors, Allison, that you talked about, is that when the reserves are not properly funded, it puts the board in a very difficult position to make a decision. In other words, there's unnecessary pressure on the board because they don't have the money. And when those things are properly reserved, the board can make a clear, concise business decision. For me, I put reserve knowledge right there next to or just behind the association governance documents. It's absolutely critical that the board understand it. And the document, if it's not something you deal with every day, it's a little arduous to look at and understand, but your property manager, absolutely, your regional director can always walk you through that. The reserve study organization. I've had some associations through Zoom, it's much easier, but they'll bring their reserve spokesperson in to talk to the audience. But I like your reference to the piggy bank because that's absolutely what this matter is. And it's just, I can't stress the importance of this particular one. We're seeing a trend in some of the markets I serve right now with, where there's larger investments in second and third homes. And the realtors are telling me that the very first thing these buyers ask is the reserve study, not the condo documents. I don't want to see the view. I don't want to see the kitchen, because that document speaks volumes about the history of the building, and it does a pretty good job of reflecting or forecasting the future as well.
I agree with you all 100%. I think that for me, I always call reserves my rainy day fund, or a rainy day fund, right? It's for when things are going to happen. It's not a matter of if these components need to be repaired or replaced. It's a matter of when. And so I'm also really big on educating residents, like y'all mentioned earlier, maybe bringing in the reserve study specialist to come in and talk. I think that's really important. But residents need to understand that, you know, you're also looking ahead. But, you know, even in our reserve study, you know, one of the things in notes, it talks about the utility life of a particular component, and it's only an estimate based on trends. So sometimes, you know, that component will go longer than expected, or it can die sooner than expected, or need to be replaced sooner than expected. Again, it's all about making sure that your community is aware that this is a great tool that the board uses to, you know, plan ahead for these capital expenditures. And Jeff, you're 100% correct. You know, as regional directors and managers, one of the very first things that we get asked when somebody's wanting to purchase into a community is, let me see that, you know, let us see the balance sheet, you know, and let us see the how much money is in reserves. And interestingly enough, you know, one of the number one questions we get is, well, how much money should there be in reserves? Should it be 300,000? Should we never cross the $400,000 mark? And, you know, the only thing I can say about that is that every community is different. It also depends where you are in the life of the community as well. And so that's a great question actually for your reserve study specialist, because they will be able to tell you exactly where you need to be and how much to have in your reserves at any given point.
Yep. And your reserve specialist is what they're gonna do for you is show you how to prepare, how to plan, how to maintain, and then where you're going to need to reserve. So again, another acronym, PPMR: prepare, plan, maintain, and reserve. And for those communities that are, you know, the envy of the other buildings in the neighborhood or the other communities in the neighborhood because they're beautiful and well maintained, is because they have followed and invested in the PPMR. They prepared, they plan, they maintain, and they reserve.
You know, one thing to keep in mind is that if you do happen to have used your reserves for a big capital expenditure, obviously your piggy bank or your rainy day fund is not going to look as great as it did maybe a year or two ago. Make sure you have a statement, or have the manager provide a statement. Let's say, for example, you know, you have a brand new buyer and they're asking to see the balance sheet and they want to see how much money is in reserves. And depending on how much money's in there, you say, oh, by the way, we just finished doing our community interior renovation. And so, you know, that will kind of help explain some of the, you know, some of the funds, or if there looks like, or it's perceived to be lower than what it's supposed to. But again, nobody can answer really that question except your reserve study specialist, and at what point in time your community is in their, you know, in their operations and in their capital expenditures.
George, I agree. It's not really a set number, and sometimes that new board, I think, who walks in and they're the ones that say, George, Jeff, Allison, what should that number be? So that is difficult. And one of the other realities here is sometimes a new board walks into this, and Travis, as you said earlier, sometimes because of things that happened 5, 10 or more years earlier, and if reserve funding has been behind the curve for that long, then that new board becomes the messenger, and that message is not always very good. But all the things we've talked about leading up to this subject, you really have to tap into communication, leadership, visuals, etc., because quite often, you know, communities have, especially if they're new and things are working well, and then, you know, again, the objective to keep maintenance fees low, there's a lot of behaviors that go into and all funnel down to the impact on the reserve. So sometimes, you know, this is a very, very touchy subject, but again, you have support from all the people that we've talked about. to help you kind of navigate those waters.
Yep. And all the more reason, just like you said, Jeff, tell the story, give the background, share the facts. You all three of you mentioned it. Oftentimes the experts that you work with or don't yet work with, engineers, reserve study companies, they're going to come out and talk to your board. They'll present to the membership. Almost always that's going to be free. They want to build relationships with your community. And so take advantage of that knowledge. Jeff, you made a great point. I think people, especially right now in today's markets, it is a direct effect on the property values of your owners. I think a lot of times when we put it in those terms, people start to understand. I know we've all heard it, hey, I'm not going to live here in 20 years. I'm not going to be around in 20 years. They don't want to contribute to the reserves. It's going to have an effect on them if and when they choose to sell their unit or their home. And so oftentimes framing those things in the right way can just help to, maybe share not so great news in the most positive and unified way possible. So all really, really great tips there. We appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and start to organize the questions that have been asked. We'll dive into those in just a second. I did real quick, just want to share a little bit of background about First Service while we get those ready. We've been in business for more than 30 years. We've become the trusted partner of associations of all types and sizes, including high-rise buildings, condo associations, HOAs, active adult and lifestyle communities. Today, we're recognized as North America's leading residential property management company all throughout the US and Canada. While today was more based on the Southeast, we certainly appreciate you all joining us today. And so let's dive in. I know we had quite a few questions here. We will get to as many as we can with the time we have left. So let's take our first question here. Maybe coming from a new board member, but can you all please clarify what, as board members, are the responsibilities or obligations to residents specifically? And Allison, why don't you start with that one?
I think we touched on this a lot. I mean, one of the most important things, and I think we talked about it much this afternoon, is communication. Your responsibility to keep your community informed. And then as a board, to align with each other and to focus on protecting, maintaining, and enhancing your community. You as a board, you need to act as one. You need to enforce your documents. You need to do that fairly. You need to maintain and enhance the value of your community, hold board meetings, send out regular communications, set goals, maintain the financial stability of your community. So we touched on sort of all of that, right? And I think the key there is to know that you are the leadership, you're supported by leadership, especially if you're with First Service Residential, and then you have your subject matter experts that you always should lean into when and if you have any questions on which direction to go.
Well, I think it's I don't know if there's anything else to add.
I'm not sure that there is. George?
No, I think I love everything she said. I think she put it in a nutshell. Again, it's creating that trust and confidence in your community, and just know to communicate.
There's a lot of responsibilities, a lot of obligations. Don't go at it alone. You don't have to. Yeah. You're volunteers.
Travis, I'll actually, on what you just said, don't go it alone. That's absolutely the key. The resources that your First Service team provides you are extensive. We know who the top players are in each of the markets we work with in regarding the advisors from a legal standpoint, engineering, the vendors in your market that are the top performing based on the properties we manage. So we are an absolute resource for you, and you just, sitting down, having those questions is really important. And as a new board member, that's probably the part that I would stress is, tap into your resources, start with us, and then we can help you navigate the path.
Don't forget to always remember to remind your residents and everyone who is a part of this community, whether from the management point or the board, from the board to the vendors, we're in it together, and that's a true statement. Everybody wants the best, and I think if we just work together, I think it just becomes a very successful and effective community.
Absolutely, the goals are the same across the board, right?
Correct.
So that's important. Let's dive into the next one. So, and this is something I know the three of you have heard a lot the last 18 months. It's been a challenge. Maintaining a sense of community has been very difficult in the past year with COVID-19, social distancing. We talked about virtual meetings. What are some of the strategies that you guys are recommending to unite maybe a divided community? I don't want to use the word broken, but just, you know, people are missing that sense of community. What are some of the tricks and tips and suggestions that you guys share with your community? George, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. You know, the most interesting part, I think, of what the last 18 months have taught us is that, you know, we really do need each other and no person is an island. I am a big proponent of when the community feels like they're not unified in some direction, or if there's a very sensitive matter, is just talk. Create an opportunity to have a town hall, whether virtual or in person, and, you know, listen to each other, you know, talk and practice empathy. You know, I think that's really, really important. And it's just about how do we understand where they're coming from and how do they understand us where we're coming from. So it's all about how we communicate. It's creating those opportunities to make sure that people feel heard. And I think that's so incredibly important, especially when there's might be some challenges with how the community is feeling at the moment.
I think this is where you know, the leadership comes in from the board, and that is setting that expectation. And the very first thing actually we talked about in today's session was, you know, the vision and mission statement. There has to be a commitment to recognize that you're living together in a community with varied interests, and everybody has a stake in it. Everybody, George, like you said in your notification letters, everybody has a role in making this community work and how they communicate. And right now there's a lot of subjects out there that have people very tense, very concerned, and, you know, everybody expresses their message in a different way. But the board needs to really set the tone for that, and you know, how to properly communicate, provide channels for people to speak, provide answers, and, you know, and maintain order throughout that process. But it's really important that every member of the community recognize that they're a part of the solution, and they have to work together, and they have elected a board that they're relying on. So asking a board how they came to that decision is a very good question. You know, sometimes, you know, I'll see meetings where accusations fly towards the board, which puts everybody on a defensive stance. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with a resident of a community saying, please help me understand how you came to this decision or how you made this choice. That allows the other party to explain their position, and things have a better order, and business can be conducted, and everyone has a voice when you do it that way.
And how I had talked about, you know, like it's an arranged marriage, right? You know, between the board and management and the residents. So I'll use another grouping here, is that it's, I think, essential if residents and the board look at each other as a team, right? And part of that team are the subject matter experts, management, the CPA, the attorney. We are all in this together. And so even though there's an election that happens every year and there's a changeover in the leadership of the residents, right? The election shouldn't be decisive. It shouldn't separate the community. This is a group of people that are all in it together. And it's really important that from one year to the next, that boards embrace each other and help and support each other, because ultimately you all are investors in the same community, and it is your home. So to create that sort of teamwork mentality and have that open communication is only going to result in a very happy marriage for everyone.
I agree with that 100%. And if you all feel that you're going to maybe put forth a very sensitive vote, or you're experiencing something in your community at the moment that perhaps, you know, it requires community input, by all means, just do a survey. You know, a survey will give you the temperature of your community. And, you know, I know every time you go somewhere, you do like a survey nowadays, it feels like, but this is so incredibly important because sometimes people want to feel like they're part of the process. Obviously, you cannot do that for every single decision, but if a decision is going to impact everyone, and it's whether financially or somehow how they live, it is always important to get the temperature. I always say this to our clients whenever they do these surveys, this is a good guide, but ultimately you're the ones that are being going to be making those decisions for the betterment of the community. But I think if people have at least a say, I think that they're going to feel part of this community.
Absolutely, and well said. I am seeing a number of questions that have to do with examples of things like mission statements, community visions, board policies like ethics and communication policies. We can absolutely and would be more than happy to provide those examples. For those that ask those questions, we'll connect with you on more of a local level and share some examples of those policies of similar communities that may help you craft your own. I think that's fantastic. That's something that we try to do all the time, and just get the wheels turning on some ideas of policies, procedures, visions that may apply to you all. So we'll be able to follow up after this webinar and connect with you all and share some of those examples. I think that's great. One more question we had. I think we can all relate to this as well. There's a challenge right now with attracting new board members. Even more so than maybe before, where it's a volunteer position. You guys have mentioned it. It's often a thankless job. What kind of tips, tricks, insights are you guys sharing as far as best practices for communities attracting new board members? Jeff, maybe you want to lead off this one.
Sure. I think we've covered a lot of the things today, and that's the appearance of the board. Again, that divided board, that disconnected board is a guarantee that it's going to be harder to get your community engaged in meetings and get your community to volunteer for anything, because nobody wants to walk into that hornet's nest, right? So again, by having that cohesive professional environment, business meetings are conducted in a business type environment. You now open it up to a broader audience just by doing that. The other thing that I see is very successful is committees. We all have talked about giving the community a voice. You've heard that from all three of us, because it's very important. They need to have a voice, and the committees are an excellent way to do that, because individuals then can reach out to the residents, garner that feedback. And I have seen on many occasions some of those committee reports come back to the board, and the nice thing is typically the committee report is shared at the board meeting, and I've seen that influence the decision of the board of directors with facts that perhaps they had not considered between the 5 or 7 or 3 of them. And that, I think, is probably one of the most powerful tools out there. And a combination of both of those, it should really reduce any challenge with attracting people.
It's almost, sorry,
go
George.
ahead. No,
yeah,
go ahead.
It's almost that boards need to have like a succession plan, right? They need to plan on who's going to take over their seat, so that you have a continuity, of information and flow of events. Because you don't want the most destructive thing for a community is from one board to the next, that everything halts and then you start from square one, because you're going to end up spending double money or taking too long for things. So if you can have a board that does that succession planning, identifies people and committees that look to, they get them involved in all the decision making, then when you move from one board to the other, it's almost seamless. Right? Just like we do in organizations and we do in our own careers. It's the same kind of thing in the community for the health and the welfare of the community at large, really.
I think that part of what I hear most of the time when somebody comes to me and they'll say, I wanted to run for the board, but, after an election, and part of what I hear is, I don't know how this functions. And so we talked a little bit about how you're leading by example. So if residents are coming to your meetings and they see that you all have a very respectful, efficient meeting, then I think that's going to help them feel better about, being able to share. Additionally, we talked a little bit about board member orientation. Maybe do it with your attorney and management and talk about what your responsibilities are and what your goals are, sharing the vision statement during that orientation. So you're setting them up for success. They want to know that, they're not just going to go in there and they're not going to know what to do. They're going to be set up for success by providing them the most concrete footing that they can have. And then lastly, sometimes, I think residents, when they have not served on a board, they feel like a sense of liability, like, oh my goodness, I don't want some decision that, that I decide to make that might come back. And, I think we need to educate. First and foremost, you're not making a sole decision. That's why we have a board of directors with, differences of opinions and votes on how you do everything. And then talk about directors and officers insurance as well, because I think that's really important for everybody to know that as long as you act in a manner that is ethical and you don't break any conflict of interest and you keep the confidentiality, any other decision, you can just make it through with, with very little resistance.
George, that's a good point. I think that there is a fear factor to that, and that new board member orientation that we do at First Service is very good for helping them kind of walk that walk and see what their resources. And again, you've heard it throughout this entire session today. Don't be hesitant as a new board member to reach out to your subject matter experts. When you rely on those professional opinions, that provides yet another layer of insulation between you and any potential action that may happen.
Excellent points. It goes back to the unified communication, right? When you have a board that's working well together, that's communicating effectively, that seems to be professional, that's leaning on their professionals and isn't causing undue liability, it's going to remove that fear or that hesitation from people wanting to be involved. And so obviously that's very important. For those commenting about all of the samples and things like that, we got you. We'll be following up. We'll include you in some of those communications. So thank you. I'm going to do one more quick one, just we have time. I think it's a simple one. So whoever wants to chime in, how can the board of directors communicate with each other without a formal board meeting? Any tips or tricks there?
I think it's all about trying to see if making time to, discuss a particular issue. I think if, we have phones, we have Zoom now, which I think has become much more prevalent. I think just use the tools that you have and making sure you set time aside. And we understand that these are volunteer positions. I mean, this is for us, this is our profession, this is our chosen career. For our board members, they're elected officials, but you really do have to make the time to, whether you do it in person or in Zoom or via email. I'm not a really huge fan of text. I think sometimes we lose a lot of what it's valuable, especially when you're making a decision. We can lose it via text because it's so short. But I will encourage you to just make the time and talk and say, and setting expectations. Maybe you're saying, hey, I would really appreciate if we can all get together, or whether virtual or by a phone, for about 10 minutes and talk about what happened or something that needs to be discussed. And so communication is key, and just make the time.
If their concern is about, in the state of Florida violating a sunshine law, getting together along that line, I mean, that's where you can use your property manager also to, communicate through them, because, the guidelines are relatively strict about, what constitutes a meeting, and you certainly don't want to violate. But there are other methods for communication. And I would say, when you speak with the property manager, they can share information and communicate and things like that. But it is a great question, because it is something the board needs to be extremely mindful of. And they also have the option to do a closed door meeting for certain matters within their jurisdiction that are allowed. And those allow the board to get together with, perhaps their attorney, and have a session that's not open to the public, because the nature of the meeting is such that it's allowed to be confidential.
Yeah, and I think you touched on exactly, I think, where the angst is, Jeff, in that boards are aware of the fact of conducting business outside of a meeting is something that they shouldn't do. So navigating those waters it can be very uncomfortable. So definitely lean into your manager, lean into your subject matter experts. The Florida statute for sunshine law encourages communication. It's not put in place to discourage communication. We've talked a lot about communication here, and the more successful you are as a board member is because you have a lot of communication with each other. It's just doing that in a way and in an arena and where you feel comfortable and you know that you're following Florida statute. So if and when you ever feel that maybe you're outside those boundaries, you can touch with association counsel and they can give you guidance.
Excellent tips there. And I think certainly that was the spirit of the question. Boards want to do the right thing, but they want to be able to get business done as well. So that's always important when we talk about that unified voice. If they can have those conversations beforehand, it maybe makes it easier to communicate in that unified voice. So that's great. There are quite a few more questions. We're not going to have time for those today. Similar to the requests for examples, to those questions we did not get to. We will reach out on an individual basis and provide some guidance, provide some color, and hopefully help in those different areas. But I want to be sensitive to everybody's time. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. To our panelists, Allison, George, Jeff, thank you so much for spending your time with us here this afternoon. For all of our attendees today, we hope it was valuable. We hope you'll reach out if there's any additional questions to those that asked. You'll be hearing from us quickly. And look out for the invite to some of our upcoming events. We have a full calendar. You can also find all of our events, past and future, on our website, fsresidential.com. So don't hesitate to connect with us. Thanks again, everybody. We hope you have an excellent day, and we hope to see you back here again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.